Hello, and welcome to all three units put into one. I'm Gerardo Santillan, and let me talk to you guys through this, a little crash course on what I believe is replicated through all the readings. Throughout all the units, there has been a clear and evident portrayal of how one is perceived and how they perceive others and their selves. The units have all shown a unifying theme or identity. Identity has been showcased from one's culture, gender, upbringing, children, and much more. All authors use their own message of style to illustrate how they are a representation of their community through their own identities and traits. To start off, we're going to focus on the first work by Billy Ray Belcourt, What is Human Possibility? The first comment that should be focused on that sets the foundation for everything is a question, what is human possibility? Found in line 7, of course. The question holds power within its context, which can be related to how human possibility is created through our own self-identification. The work may take a somber approach at the question, mentioning the idea of humans as only matter, but it also implies that our bodies are created and find a reason. This can be seen through the way that Belcourt talks about humans and defeat and somber attitudes towards oneself. And as we may be, as mentioned, brittle and bones, inside we are much more. We are the decisions that we make and the choices that we take, which creates the foundation for what the units focus on. The outlying idea of identity. The second work, Under You're Always Light, by Leanne Simpson, is a story of triumph and glory made through the help of our ancestors. The story plays off the idea that under you're always light, to quote both the title and a line in the work, which can be an implication that our souls were created by those who made us. In this case, it does not mean only our parents, but their parents and the parents and parents come here and there. The focus on identity is focused on how well we allow our past to define us. In this case, the past defines us positively, as we are built from generations of great people. For that reason, Simpson mentions, follow us. Our identity is defined by the way we set a path for those who come. That means the way that we uphold our children, the way that we teach them, the way that we teach our education and teach our heritage to the world around us. As an overall theme, identity is being foreshadowed in the careers and the choices we make. An example of this comes from Kunapa Hanska's Weaponizing Your Privilege. In his interview, he consistently talks about him and two different elements, his ancestors and his own personal actions. Hanska's identity is as an artist, but more importantly, he is here to help the community around him. He believes our lives are determined by how we help others. This is portrayed by the way he mentions indigenous communities and the way that he mentions that his privilege is a weapon, that he uses his platform to advocate for those people around him, the people who are otherwise misdemeanored and harmed in a culture and society that does not necessarily care about them. Identity comes in the form that the way that we treat our environment. Hanska mentions the environment speaks to us. He's implying that our identity is formed not only by our own person, but by the way that we treat the world. This comes from, of course, indigenous worldviews of respecting nature, because nature is in itself an identity. The way that we care for it is the same way that we are going to care for ourselves. And the more that we care for a world means that we are going to care for a world that our children will grow up in, and that their children will grow up in, and so forth and so on. And for that reason, he mentions helping others reach their goals and desires. And as mentioned earlier, he uses his platform to advocate for all these people and to advocate for others who may otherwise not have the same opportunities as he has. As for his identity, he's an artist, he's a philanthropist, he's a community helper, an environmentalist. It showcases us that one doesn't have to succumb to only one characteristic. That identity is what you decide to be, and that is decided by the actions that you take. All of this brings us into Unit 2, which actually covers identity a little bit more into depth. which, ironically enough, is a title of Carol Romero's documentary, Identity, which is aimed at telling a story through pictures. She mentions that her photography is not just a stylistic choice, but rather photography with an approach, which means that every photograph that she takes is not only to please the eyes, but also to reach to the viewers, to grab their attention and convey a message. This can be seen in one of her photographs titled Noemi, a modern woman portrayed as an American doll girl. And what may seem a beautiful piece is actually an even greater piece once you start realizing the symbolization that comes with it. The traditional clothes is an identification for Romero herself, as a way she portrays herself not only to her friends and peers, but to the community around her. As she is part of the American culture and American society, deep down she is still indigenous, she is still part of her roots, and she cares very deeply about that. More importantly, it can also be the identity that others give us. This may be a representation of the assimilation that happened during the colonial periods and the brutal history that was to follow it. These examples obviously create an identity that oneself doesn't actually believe in, but the world around us does, which we'll jump into a little bit later on. Finally, it comes into the idea of Photoshop and Romero's idea of indigenous worldviews. She uses Photoshop not only to convey meaning, but also to provide a style of mystic and fantasy that we otherwise would not see in real life, which to her is a representation of who her family is and how her heritage has impacted her. This means that she believes that indigenous and indigeneity emerges in modern time, and her identity comes as an artist, as a photographer, as a mother, and as a woman. And she uses this platform to advocate and educate for those generations to come. In the same area, Lisa Jackson's video Savage, a short film, Lisa Jackson herself, a film director, looks to take identity and how it's stripped away from us. Identity in this case is stripped away through the American school system. As one can see in her short film, a girl attending an American public school is surrounded by darkness in front of a staircase where no one seems to be around. What does this mean exactly? It means that our identity is changed by the world that we live in. It is changed by the people that we grow up in and the education that we are given. For that reason, the line, "Come back to me," has so much potential. It means that the woman calling for the little girl wants her to come back to her roots, come back to her heritage, come back to her ancestors, and never truly lose sight of who she is. The more depressing meaning comes at the final scene where the children start to dance. And in this dance, they appear lifeless. They appear as if they were zombies. And the message here is that sometimes your identity is crushed and it is stolen and it cannot be brought back, thus making you a humanless life form. Or in this case, a zombie. Overall, the dark scenes and the dark environment of the school is a representation of fear, a fear of losing oneself, a fear of losing one's children, and a fear of losing one's heritage. The last piece in Unit 2 is Whereas by Layli Long Soldier, which is more of an identity crisis through gender. Gender as a woman, and more importantly, an indigenous woman. Layli Long Soldier takes this approach of a poem that is an interaction between a man and a woman, where the man does not completely understand that the reparation and all the hardship that came to Native Americans was not what the American school system wants you to believe. He mentions to the woman, well, at least there was an apology, which not only erases the culture and erases the harm and erases everything that happened to a culture of people that were here before anyone else, but is a bigger response. and it is an erasure of identity. It's telling a soldier that what happened did not matter because there was just a no, I'm sorry at the end of it. Soldier is implying that identity is stolen through lack of education, through bigotry, and through ignorance. Also through the mention of peaceful interactions, which not only eliminates the idea that people were murdered, but also eliminates the idea that they continue to be murdered, and there was never truly a peace agreement. And finally, Soldier mentions that she wanted to kick the legs of the man's chair to show him that she can fight back, but she didn't, because her identity is not a fighter. She is a person, and she wants to be heard, and she knew that violence was not the answer. She knew that stooping down to their level was not going to create anything. It wasn't going to fix anything, so she stayed quiet. As for identity, that means that our identities are hushed. They're put away when we're in situations that are not meant for us, situations that are there to harm us. The final unit, Unit 3, consists of art and using our identity not to be shunned, but to embrace it, to love, and to educate. The Resistance by Echo Hawk is a story portrayed of how art has changed over time and how we view indigenous art, not only in the traditional aspect, but also in the modern world. Echo Hawk talks about the loss of our agriculture and the loss of culture. This idea stems away from assimilation, but just over time, how he started to develop his own style, obviously inspired by his ancestry. And he mentions that a lot of people don't know what his art's about, and they erase the modern indigenous people because they say the way that we sing, as mentioned by Echo Hawk, and they see the art of before, but they do not consider the art of the present. For that reason, Echo Hawk uses his color to convey meaning. He uses traditional colors. He uses colors that otherwise in other cultures may be erased, but in his, they have meaning, and that meaning gives hope. He identifies with the colors. It's no longer just a pigment on a piece of canvas, but rather a part of him. His identity is through his art. He mentions that his art is a way that he'll live forever. The way that he contributes to the world is through brand deals that exhibit indigenous culture and exhibit the modern culture that he so loves. For him, identity is art. Identity is preserving something and taking it and making it your own. Additionally, the second piece of art comes from the performance for missing and murdered indigenous women posted by the Fairness Works. Despite not having much words or lyrics, this dance conveys much more meaning than it plays off the idea that Echo Hawk mentioned. Traditional versus modern. It can be seen through, obviously, their dance, but also the music style that they're using. What otherwise would be traditionally used only as a drum and voice is now turned into a techno beat. This music style is not only a representation of culture, but it's also a representation of style and personality, and most importantly, identity. Now, the identity in this is a little bit different from what we've been covering. The identity is of those who have gone missing, the women who have been murdered, because, as mentioned, 7 times more likely will indigenous women be murdered than any other type of woman. The identity here is showcased through the photos, the dance, and the style. It is to bring awareness, for identity isn't just oneself, but the way that we interact with the world, as we mentioned earlier. The dance is used to convey meaning, to convey style, more importantly, to convey the idea of nature and how we are all one. For that reason, The backdrop is of a street. It's a beautiful street. It conveys the meaning of nature. That we are endowed to nature. That we are part of nature. And in our nature, we will find our woman. And we will find those who are missing. The identity in here is speaking out. It means educating and creating yourself not only as a dancer and a performer, but as an advocate and educator. The last piece comes from Nikita Longman, titled For Colton, a short poem, which mentions the line, "You may be met with shaky hands and Mayflower weapons." And before we talk about identity, it's important to realize that this is clearly an allusion to the first colonizers coming and hurting indigenous people. And what does this mean for the reader now? For, in this case, Colton. They were never part of colonization, and never will they be, for that is in the past. But this example and this line gives us the idea that our past defines who we are now, which is where identity comes in. Our art defines us, our style defines us, but more importantly, we are defined by the world around us. And this means the parts that we don't want to be defined as. That comes from our past. And in this case, for indigenous people, it comes from colonization, from a past where people have been hurt and your ancestors were tortured. This comes from a past where people have been labeled as savages, as mentioned in other works. And it's taking these ideas and rejecting them. That's why one of the lines is, "Your beautiful brown bodies." Because it's not a label in this case. It is a compliment of what we are intended to be. And it is a compliment of what the world wants us to be, for the sun gave us the brown bodies. And we must love who we are. This piece, overall, wraps up everything. Because identity is one's love for oneself, one's love for one's body, one's love for the past, and one's love for the world and everything that exists in it. And the final line that mentions lands that your ancestors generously groomed and gifted. Which comes back down to it, identity is formed by those who come with us. And for that reason, all these pieces have been mentioning the same idea, that we have to use our presence and what we do to define those who come after us, and those who come after them, and so on and so forth. Because heritage defines our labels. Not those that people give us, but those that we want.